Hello again, everyone. We are, what are we now? Six sessions down, 2 to go on day 3 of WFS Live. If you've been here all the way through, thank you very much for your attendance and your attention. It's a fantastic commitment. And for those of you just joining us, particularly any journalists present, by the way, lots of different things that you can access. In the newsroom by EFO, we've got newswires in English, Spanish and Arabic. Video highlights of each panel will be uploaded to a Google Drive that will be shared with the media, and also selected content distributed by SNTV, our new media partner, to clients globally. So you've got all bases covered there, and lots of different ways to watch back as well if you miss anything, if you're a delegate for WFS Live. Now, Chad Biagini of Nella Partners very smoothly passed the baton on to this next session. In the last one, we was talking towards the end about advice for prospective foreign owners of European clubs. And this is part of the talking points, I guess, that we're going to get into this next panel, which is on global investment in football, widening the perspective of the industry in partnership with Portas Consulting. Now, foreign investment in football is nothing new. You might remember when Roman Abramovich took over Chelsea. Not just Russian, of course. We've had Chinese money flowed in from the Gulf states, of course, as well. But in particular now, the West is investing. We have, historically at least, the two biggest clubs in England with American owners. That's Liverpool and Manchester United. But it doesn't stop there, because Americans now hold major stakes in around 20% of the 60 teams playing across the top divisions in England, France and Italy. Their influence even extends to the Nordic and Scandinavian countries and leagues there too. The trend is set to continue, but why? Maybe European football offers more value than traditional US sports right now, especially during the pandemic. It's seen as an optimal channel to promote a brand by being associated with big name sponsors and stakeholders, and even to position and build a brand to win new markets and customers even globally. Maybe if you're super ambitious, it's about emulating the model of Abu Dhabi-backed City Football Group, diversifying revenue streams, profits, synergies, creating a football platform that can go public, attracting institutional investors and getting a multi-billion valuation. Why ever not? Let's think big. Now, this session, as I mentioned, is in partnership with Portas Consulting. Let's introduce your speakers. Here they are. The president at Elevate Sports Ventures, Chip Bowers, chairman and co-owner at FC Helsingor, Jordan Gardner, co-chairman at Phoenix Rising FC, Brett Johnson, also partner at Portas Consulting, Patrick Massey, and our moderator for this session, CEO at Goalnomics, Brando, Hanna, Navarré. Brando, absolutely fascinating topic you have to take us through. Please do so.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, David, and World Football Summit, and all the people watching us. I'm Brando, Hanna. I'm delighted to be a CEO and co-founder of Goalnomics. We are a leading sport management firm with an extensive track record in merger and acquisition and advising activities for investor and sport entities. Today, we have an amazing panel on global investment in football, widening the perspective of the industry, where we'll be talking about the big trends, strategies we need to keep our eyes on the next coming month. But before we dive into the panel discussion, I'd like to introduce our wonderful speakers that will join us today. First of all, Jordan. Hi, Jordan. Jordan is a sport executive and investor in several football clubs across Europe, including Swansea City in the United Kingdom and Dundalk FC in the Republic of Ireland. Right now, Jordan is the co-chairman and managing director of the FC Helsingør. Brett Johnson. Hi, Brett. Brett is the co-chairman of the Phoenix Rising Sun USL team in Championship Division professional soccer team based in Phoenix, Arizona. And we have here Chip Bowers, president of Elevate Sport Ventures, with over 24 years of experience as a senior leader with some of the most relevant brands in the sport, like Golden State Warriors, Miami Marlins, among other top brands. And finally, we have here Patrick Massey. Hi, Patrick.
Hi.
Patrick has served as advisor to leading major national and international sports organizations and leaders of multinational corporations over the past years. Right now, he works with Portas Consulting as football in the football in Europe, which includes working with leading international federation, national association, leagues, and clubs. So, Patrick, hi everyone. Please, Patrick, give us some insight about trends and opportunities that you are seeing right now in the football investment leagues and competition at the moment.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Brando. And it's a pleasure to be here. I think talking about a super interesting topic and with a great set of fellow panelists. I think the really interesting thing is, I think David touched on it a bit at the beginning. We've seen historically lots of investments into clubs. I think the interesting trend we're seeing now is increased investor interest into football leagues and competitions themselves. So I think down the years, there's been a lot of investment historically into clubs, into competitions, for kind of US sports and international sports. But I think in the last 18 months, we've seen growing interest in a wider range of sports businesses. I think we've seen that outside of football, with the likes of Cosmos investing into the Davis Cup, CVC investing into rugby. But we're now beginning to see this play out in football, with increased investment into football leagues, with the likes of Serie A's recent deal. And I'm really confident that as we go forwards, we'll see more of these types of investments into football leagues in Europe, both in the bigger established leagues, but also in the smaller leagues. And I think when you look at that, it's really interesting because I think it's being driven by two things. I think firstly, we're seeing investors really recognizing there's a lot of value left on the table in football leagues in Europe. I think a real belief that they are potentially sub-optimized compared to US competitions, and an ability to create value through maybe changing some things around that have historically been the same way for a long time. I think we're also seeing that kind of trend of the blurred lines between sport and entertainment driving increased investor interest in football. And people are now seeing football as a great way to create really compelling content that they can use to grow audiences in new markets through digital platforms. I think the other really interesting trend we're seeing is also, I think, the leagues and the competitions themselves beginning to recognize this opportunity. And I think we're also seeing that kind of forcing them to rethink the way they organize themselves, in particular, thinking about how they can structure themselves differently to be able to actually enable that private investment to happen. And in particular, I think what we're seeing is a lot of leagues thinking about actually how can I separate out my commercial rights from my kind of regulatory part of my body, so I can kind of maintain that role as safeguard and custodian of my sport, but provide a cleaner asset and a simpler asset for that investor to come in and invest in. And again, I think we're seeing that outside of football, in the likes of the International Table Tennis Federation, creating World Table Tennis as their commercial arm. And I think more and more in the next few years, we'll see that becoming more of a regular part of football leagues as well.
Okay, related to women's football, are you expecting an increase in investments in this field in the next coming years?
I think when I talk about women's football, I think it's incredibly exciting, and I think from an investment perspective, there's huge opportunities there, and I think we've all heard about some of the really impressive stats that the games have in recent years, whether that's kind of 1 billion people watching the World Cup, and whether that's some of the domestic leagues now beginning to have triple-digit growth. But for me, I think the really exciting thing is when you remember that those numbers are great, but they really are only just the beginning. And women's football is really at the outset of its journey. And I think it has huge growth potential, both in terms of the revenue women's football itself can generate directly, but also the incremental value it can add to the whole game. I think if I was an investor looking at women's football, then I would definitely be super excited. I think if you look out to say 2030, I don't think it's unfeasible to think that women's football will have kind of crowds of 15,000 plus. They'll have probably be amongst the most viewed sports leagues in the world, and I think they'll have broadcast values that reflect that, potentially even exceeding numbers like 50 million euros. So I think when you think about those kind of facts and figures, and you put that in the context of broader sports, I think women's football could be kind of bigger than basically every other sport out there, outside of football. So I think huge commercial value on the table, but I think almost a kind of an extra set element of excitement in women's football is it's different, right? It offers something different to investors that men's football simply can't. So it offers you a clean sheet. You can kind of recreate competition. You can recreate the way things work without having to be so worried about how things are kind of set up in the past and the precedent that's gone before. I think it offers you as an investor wider opportunities to be successful on the pitch in a way that might be harder to achieve in men's football without a huge investment. And I think it also offers really exciting things like purpose, offers things like really unique role models that are really accessible and I think really relatable. I think simply offers an opportunity to engage and hopefully one day also I'm sure one day also monetize kind of new and existing fans in a way that men's football can't. I think one final thing I think I would add before closing on that is I think it's a hugely exciting opportunity, but I think it has to be also for the right investor. And I think I say the right investor because I think women's football's been growing and growing super fast. But actually, when you look under the bonnet at the moment, there's quite a lot of basics that still need to be put in place. So I think that right investor really needs to work hard to make it happen. I think women's football is different to men's football. So again, I think the right investor needs to not just recognize that, but really lean into it and really see the opportunity for them to bring new capabilities to the sport, to partner with the sport that kind of really brings out the opportunity that women's football has, I think, to leapfrog men's football in many areas. So yeah, I think in summary, it's a super exciting opportunity. I think if I was an investor, it would be one of the hot areas that I'd be looking at. But I think it has to be that investor who's bringing those capabilities, who really understands what the sport's about, and who's prepared to work hard and to innovate.
Right. Very helpful. For Chip, I know that you have a great experience with global brands. I mean, what is the perspective of the global football brand? What is a football still a must for sponsorship partnership in every global brand marketing mix right now?
Well, first and foremost, Brando, I just want to say hello to our World Football Summit family. The group at Elevate Sports Ventures is humbled to be a part of this panel, so thank you for including us. To your point, I think global football continues to be one of the most marketable, sectors in our industry. The passion behind the game of football is palpatory, right? It's something that you see not just in the EPL or Serie A or La Liga, but certainly you now see in MLS, you see in USL, and here in American soccer. I think the fact that the marketability continues to grow, I think because it's a global game, you see a lot of outreach on behalf of brands to different sectors around the world where they're trying to be storytellers. It allows them to be targeted in terms of where they have operations in different sectors. It allows them to leverage the passion points that their consumers have with those particular football brands. So I suspect we'll continue to see great investment into global football. I think the fact that you see ownership groups, to your last question, continuing to invest, American ownership groups investing in global football shows you their interest in diversifying their own portfolios. I think there's a lot of shared intellect that comes from teams having various interests, whether that be in the MLS, USL, NISA, global football. I think there's a lot that can be shared from a best practices standpoint. I think when you think about brands specifically, there's a great opportunity for brands to really think through the activation of those relationships. And so when you think about how you can leverage the passion points of a Manchester United, a Man City, a Leeds, Liverpool, the list is endless. I think there's a chance for them to really think about, as we view it, there's a reverberation of energy that comes from how you position a brand in the marketplace tied to a sports property or entertainment property. It starts locally, it builds regionally, it extends nationally, and then when you have oversight of a global opportunity, it really gives you a chance to be very fluid in your storytelling. It gives you a chance to really think about the needs and interests of your consumers. Those that are big fans of Man City or Man U or Phoenix Rising are also fans of the game. So when you really think about how to leverage your investment in that particular property, taking that to a league or to a global game perspective really changes people's view of that particular brand and allows them to lean in a way that maybe you couldn't do that otherwise. Sports and entertainment, in my opinion, are great amplifiers for the things that a lot of brands are already spending against. So how do they leverage their digital channels, their electronic media, things that they may do in terms of experiential marketing, tying that back to their investments into global football, I think is a really intelligent way to cut through the clutter. So I think we're going to continue to see more of it. I think there's a great value in it. I don't think the pandemic is really going to alter that all that much. I think if anything else, there's going to be a renewed hunger coming out of the global pandemic that I think people are going to be anxious to come back together. They're going to be anxious to utilize sport as a point of, an opportunity to galvanize a community to bring them out of a tragic situation and really support one another in something that everybody can find a common interest in.
Very interesting, guys. related to the football clubs, we are in recent years and months in Europe, we have witnessed a large increase in football club takeovers carried out mainly by professional financial investors. Most of them come from the United States. So I would like to know what factors, financials, UEFA regulations, synergies in European football are these investors considering attractive?
Well, I think, again, a lot of the things, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Chip, sorry.
No, Jordan, that was your question. I apologize. There was a pause there. So I was thinking that Brando was looking for me to chime in on that particular topic as well.
No, that's okay. No, Chip, you hit on some of this on the last question. I mean, I think we're seeing huge growth in American investment in European football in particular. I mean, I think we're kind of seeing this second wave where maybe 10 to 15 years ago, Americans would come in and buy clubs in the English Premier League, and maybe it was more of a vanity project, and there was not necessarily a strong understanding of the kind of global game structure. And now I think you're seeing much more sophisticated investment. I think the question that I get asked a lot is what is kind of causing this, and what is the kind of the data points that are pointing towards Europe. And I think there's a lot of different reasons, but certainly entry points into European football in general are much lower than North America. Franchise valuations across the four major sports, and in addition, MLS in North America are just getting to the point where they're outpricing a lot of potential investors. And I think you can come in, even go into a second division in Spain, Italy, France, UK, and you can buy a club for 15 or 20 million euros, and that doesn't necessarily exist in North America quite yet. I think there are opportunities, as Chip said, to kind of use best practices from North America, professionalize a lot of these clubs in a way that can actually add a lot of value from a financial perspective. Something that kind of Patrick brought up a little bit earlier is the attractiveness of the media rights. And I think that's something that, at least comparing North American soccer to European football, we're not quite there yet in North America in terms of seeing large media rights. You can go to the English Premier League and get large media payouts, and that can kind of really be an attractive area in terms of investment. I think Chip would know these guys. I know the guys like at the 49ers, for instance, in San Francisco, made a minority investment in Leeds, I think 2 years ago. I think that was super smart. I think they're looking at it saying, look, we know how to operate a professional sports franchise in North America really well. Maybe we don't quite know European football yet. Let's make a strategic minority investment. Let's get a seat on the board. Let's get over there and learn. And over a period of years, then we can figure out how do we transition to make a larger potential investment into European football. And obviously they've had success with a good strategic partner at Leeds. So that's kind of my investment philosophy too, is like, let's make small strategic investments, start small, prove your model, prove your success, and then scale upwards, which, it doesn't sound super sexy when, for us, for instance, we're at a small club in Scandinavia, but everything we deal with on a day-to-day basis running a football club is no different than what Leeds does in the Premier League, a factor of zeros on our P&L at the end of the day.
Very interesting, Jordan. Okay, so COVID-19. Okay, right now we have coronavirus. So is this a threat or opportunity in the football takeovers for the next month? Where are we going to start in these football club valuations, for example?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I think when COVID first hit, you saw a lot of people talking about, look, this is the time, clubs are going to go out of business, valuations are going to heavily decrease. And that didn't happen. I think a lot of clubs were well capitalized enough to get through a period over the summer where games weren't happening and fans weren't attending the games. I think the challenge you're seeing in European football now is a lot of clubs didn't anticipate, to their detriment, a kind of a second and third wave of COVID. And you're seeing now the fact that no fans are at the games over a longer extended period of time, presumably into 2021, being very problematic. So I think right now, I would say, is when we're starting to see club valuations dip. I was just seeing that, there's discussions about an American group coming into West Brom, and that they're looking at valuations that in my mind are significantly than what you would traditionally see with an English Premier League club pre-COVID. So I think the challenge that you have is from us being, looking at it from a kind of a more savvy, sophisticated financial perspective, we anticipated no fans being at our games this year. We anticipated a really distressed transfer market. And if that was all incorrect assumptions, great. Like, we played the worst case scenario game, which is what you should do in the business world. But so many clubs I speak with just made these false assumptions that everything was going to kind of go back to normal. And now they're halfway through the season and kind of realizing, oh, wait, I don't have enough money to pay my bills going into 2021. I need to cash out some of my LPs. I'm really distressed right now. And so I think it kind of goes to the bigger conversation of the way a lot of these European football clubs are run, particularly smaller to medium-sized clubs that are kind of run hand to mouth, and there's not a lot of strategic financial thinking. So, long story short, I believe in Q1 and Q2 of 2021, you're going to see much more movement when it comes to distress assets and decreases in valuations in European football clubs.
Thank you, Jordan. Very interesting point. Brett, do you have something to add?
Well, thank you. I'd like to echo how honored I am to be on this panel, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm bullish. I'm bullish long term. COVID has been a disaster. There's no other way to describe it. I think, to Jordan's point, for those of us that kind of approach this broader space, looking at it from a very long-term perspective, you should be prepared for these, black swan events. The question is, how much longer will it continue? It sounds like there's a lot of encouraging data, which will provide some form of relief in terms of crowds returning, et cetera. So, but in the short term, it's not romantic. And for those clubs that don't have the depth of balance sheet to weather it, I do think, as Jordan said, there's going to, rightly so, be some turmoil and some valuations that'll probably be eye-popping. But all that being said, like everyone else on this panel, I'm very bullish about the broader sector. I see, and we're fairly close to making an investment in England. I'm very proud of the investment I have and the involvement with Jordan and his team in Denmark with Helsingor. And I do believe that over time, especially in the United States, I think there's going to be a lot of cross-border transactions going both ways. And you're seeing it. I mean, in USL, the Iowa franchise, I think, is now an investor in Parma. There's a Texas franchise that owns a stake in Liga MX. Phoenix Rising, we've got an affiliation with Galatasaray. I believe that there's so much synergy, and it doesn't have to be the city model. It can take a lot of different forms. But over time, and I guess the last point I'd like to make is, I am also very bullish on the women's game. I think if you're invested in the men's side, that it makes a lot of sense to try to figure out how to launch a women's side. I'm very interested in NWSL. I think they've done a great job. And I could see over time, both in Phoenix, and then I'm also standing up the franchise in Rhode Island, USL Championship franchise. I'm very interested, and I'm building the stadium specifically in mind, with also adding an NWSL franchise if I'm so fortunate to convince that league to let me buy one.
Interesting.
And I'll really quickly, I'm just going to piggyback on what Brett said really quickly. When I put a group together about 1.5 years ago to invest in a club in Europe, in Denmark, really what I wanted to do is I wanted to bring people that had expertise in sports, obviously soccer. And that's why people like Brett, I brought on board, other people who had investments in Major League Soccer, people who had investments in European football like myself. And more American groups are coming to the table and saying, how do we leverage, even if we're LPs in an American investment, leverage that experience into Europe? So that was one of the priorities that I had when I bought a European football club.
Coming back to the last point about increased investment into leagues, competitions, and clubs, you have experience in the both sides and sell side. What learnings will you share with both investors and leagues on what to get right to set up a structure of a successful deal? Patrick, maybe you can give us some insight here.
Yeah, happy to. As I said, I think there's going to be a big amount of investment in the coming years in not just clubs, but in leagues. And I think, again, it's something we've done a lot of thinking about and had a number of conversations around. Although I think it's a really exciting area, that investment into leagues, I think there's not many kind of playbooks out there as to how to really get that right. And I think although investors are right when they think there's a lot of value on the table in leagues, and I think when you look at the US model and you compare it to the UK model and you think about things like whether it should be closed, more leagues around Europe, whether there's opportunities to centralize leagues versus clubs a bit more to create greater revenue opportunities, I think there is a lot of value on the table. But I think when we have those conversations with investors, I think the thing that I think probably my biggest bit of advice would be is to really understand the politics of it all. I think you have to kind of remind yourself that a lot of these leagues in Europe are often owned by either the clubs themselves or by federations or governing bodies, which aren't particularly necessarily always open to change. They're very established organizations with a lot of culture, a lot of history, a lot of tradition. So I think although there is a lot of sub-optimization, a lot of opportunity in European leagues, I think there's also true that kind of stuff is hard to change. And I think a lot of investors could think a bit smarter around kind of doing their normal due diligence, but also complementing that with really understanding how the sport works, really getting under the skin of the politics of the sport, of the stakeholders in the sport, of how things like funding flows work in European sport. That's obviously very different to private sector investments. So I think on the investor side, we're really thinking about that politics. So at the beginning and even throughout the deal, you are able to corral the stakeholders to actually make that change happen, which is what you need to do to unlock the value of that investment.
Related to the side?
I think on the sell side, again, I think it's an interesting one. I think you have a lot of leagues who are really for the first time ever getting offers and interest from investors, and I think for them there's a few important things to do because it's something many of them haven't really experienced before. I think one of those is really to start the question with the why, and not get too sucked into the numbers and what the money is and this is the best offer, can I get a better offer? But actually to take a step back and say, why am I trying to do this? How does this fit in with my strategy? How does it help me deliver on what I'm trying to achieve or otherwise? So I think that's probably the number one bit of advice. I think otherwise, I think the other thing to think about is if it is capital, if that's why you're doing it, then actually what other options are there out there? I think private equity can, for example, be a great option. It brings a lot of benefits like capabilities and transformation with it, but there are other options on the table. Debt financing, for example, can be a really sensible option if you don't need so much capital. And then I think thinking a bit more broadly than that, I think the other thing you can do is, as a league, kind of put yourself in the investor's shoes. I think a lot of these leagues do have a lot of value left on the table. So I think as a league, you can kind of think through, if I was an investor, what would my 100-day plan be for my league? What are those easy, quick wins that I can do to generate my own revenue, and also to kind of clean my sport up to make it more attractive and more easy to invest in? And then I think finally, this is a fairly obvious one to say, but one we don't see done enough is because of that growing interest, take advantage of that. Don't just have a conversation with the first person who comes to talk to you and has a conversation with you, but actually think about whether you can make that into a competitive process. Actually do your own work to create your own investment proposal, go to market, make it a competitive process, and use that tension to drive a higher valuation and to give yourself ultimately more leverage and control and how that deal is structured.
Thank you, Patrick. Chip, coming back to you, given your experience with major global brands, naming rights, kit, patch, deals, etc., what are the components of a successful deal between leagues, franchises, and brands? What is the anatomy of a successful deal structure between leagues and global brands?
Yeah, I think the most important thing that, we consulted Elevate Sports Ventures, a number of MLS properties and teams in different leagues. And the one advice that we always give people, whether we're consulting, we're actually leading the sale of some of those key assets, is that really you have to take an approach of how do I build long-term sustainable success? And that starts at the smallest asset you're selling and extends all the way to the largest assets that you're selling. And it's really important that teams and leagues look at this as a way to engage their consumer and fan base through their brand partnerships. And so you're investing not just in an asset if you're a brand, you're really investing in a platform. And something that Patrick just said really resonated with me when he talked about the sale of franchises when they're looking for investors is what's the why? Why am I doing this? What am I looking for? And I think the key is teams and leagues have to have the exact same approach. Too often it becomes transactional. And fans today are far too savvy to embrace a brand partnership that's associated with their team and league if it's viewed solely as a transactional relationship. The real key here is to make sure that those brands give those brands the opportunity to tell a story that really ties back to a larger platform around the game itself. So you've got to deal with really brands that understand activation, that they have a true appreciation for investing in various layers of that consumer interaction. I've said for years, I'm a true believer that nowadays consumers and fans have a wake to sleep mentality in terms of how they engage with their properties. So the teams that they support, the leagues that they support, the last thing they look at when they go to bed is the scores of the league, how their team performed, how the players performed. It's the first thing they look at the next day. And if it's match day, the first thing they check out is what time is the match? Where is it being played? Are my players hurt? So you've got to understand how people engage with that content. So when you look at a jersey partnership, a kit deal, you look at a naming rights deal, how do you effectively weave in a brand into that conversation that the consumer is having beyond the game itself? They're having it with their friends, they're having it with their family, they're having it in digital and social platforms. The key is you want to seamlessly integrate them into that experience in a way that they embrace and they don't actually push away. And so as I look at, certainly kit partnerships, you're literally putting your brand on the chest and across the heart of your favorite athletes and your favorite team. So with that becomes a great deal of responsibility. And when I was working in the NBA with the Golden State Warriors, it's a conversation that we had frequently with the NBA and the National Basketball Association about the responsibilities the teams have when selling the patch. The same conversation we'll have with global brands around the investment in global football is that you've got to understand that it has to mean something to the player. Your involvement with the franchise has to mean something to ownership, to the community at large, and certainly to the fan and your consumer. And you can't take that responsibility for granted, because as soon as you do, the consumer will turn off their attention. Same thing with naming rights. It's not just the activation around the game itself, but what is the activation within the community beyond the game? What kind of community events are you having? What are you doing in entertainment beyond the sport? Getting the fans more familiar with how the venue operates, getting them closer to the interactivity that they have within this particular venue and how it's viewed as a community asset. So to me, that's the real key. Brands have to understand that they have a responsibility on behalf of their consumer base to tell an appropriate story, and at the same time be appropriately disruptive. Constantly come up with unique ways to engage them. Think about ways to re-envision or reimagine how they can actually utilize their engagement with the players, with the league, in a way that ultimately separates themselves from their competition base.
Thank you, Chip. I totally agree with you. I would like to take right now trends in global football strategies, in strategies investments in the football. So let me know, what about the multi-club ownership strategy right now? Is it to stay? What do you think will happen to the clubs that don't know go towards this model? Will they stay behind?
I could chime in on that one. I get asked a lot about, people wanting to replicate the City Football Group model. And I think, obviously what City Football Group does is on a huge global scale, and there's geopolitical reasons they do what they do. But I do think multi-club ownership strategy is an emerging trend in this industry. And I think it's important. I mean, just from a player development perspective and player sales perspective, FIFA has started to put rules and regulations in place to limit the number of players that you as a club can put out on loan and you can have under contract as loan players. So I think it's important to utilize a multi-club strategy to develop your players, to have clubs at different levels of development. So if you bring a player, let's say from South America, they can come into an entry-level club, let's say in the second or third tier in Portugal, for instance. They can develop over a period of 2 to 3 years and then move to maybe a team in France and then move eventually up the food chain. And I think the thing that's exciting for me is that oftentimes these clubs are so poorly run in general that, it's like any other business. If you control the entire pipeline, you can make sure that all the clubs in your portfolio are philosophically aligned, from a similar playing style to a similar coaching style, to making sure the players are taken care of off the field, making sure that the top level of your club is constantly evaluating that player's development. I think so many clubs in Europe, they kind of, I don't want to say hoard players, but they'll bring in 50, 60, 70 young players. They'll loan them out. There's not a ton of oversight in terms of their actual development. Some clubs do a good job, other clubs don't. So I think, look, the multi-club ownership strategy makes a ton of sense. You can use economies of scale from a human capital perspective. You can really bring in really smart, savvy people on the commercial side. And of course, there's differences between these markets in Europe, between doing sponsorship and commercial in Spain and France and Belgium and Portugal. But I think if you bring in really smart people from a commercial side, and obviously being an American, that's, I think, what one of our strengths is in this industry. I think that's super important. And then, the more assets you have in play from a club perspective, the more you can do really interesting, creative things that aren't really happening in the industry. And whether that's, using your platform to invest in sports technologies and then beta testing that technology in your clubs. Maybe that technology is more well suited for a smaller club in a smaller league. Maybe that technology is more a fan game day experience that should be well suited to your team at the top of the food chain. So I think it's really interesting, the multi-club portfolio model and idea and thesis. The challenge that I have is I don't think a lot of actually what it takes, both from a financial, from an actually operation and execution perspective, because it's a massive undertaking, let alone just operating one club in Europe, being a foreign ownership group, saying we're going to own five. And in the term, how do you go into developing markets and saying, well, there's real potential to go into India and Mexico and some of these other markets, those assets as part of your multi-club strategy. But again, that's a longer term play. I think at some point people are going to crack that nut from a really smart, sophisticated way, looking at it really purely from an investment standpoint, maybe not for other reasons like City Football Group does. And I think it's only a matter of time.
Hey, Brando, I'll piggyback what Jordan just said, too. I think it's important for people to understand the value from a business operations perspective to allow some of these teams to be really a training opportunity for staff that you want to move up into some of your top tier clubs. It also gives you a category opportunity to invest in a lot of the key brands that are out there to get them to see the value in the sport at a smaller entry level from an investment standpoint, and then move them up into some of the top tier teams over time as maybe someone in that category no longer is a good fit for that particular property. So I think there's a lot of value tied to the multi-tier, multi-team investment strategy. But to Jordan's point, you've got to be a really savvy, business person to really see through some of the challenges that are there and really have a big picture, as Brett mentioned, long-term strategy around the game itself.
Thank you, Chip and Jordan, for this insight. Brett, do you want to add something that the World Cup 2026, as you know, is an opportunity for potential clubs and investors to start to decide to invest in North America? I don't know, mainly in leagues like USL, MLS2, if it's going to be, or NISA.
Yeah, I think World Cup 26 can't overstate how important and valuable and catalytic it will be for the U.S. Obviously, 94 World Cup launched MLS, and as a country, it really made a huge difference. So I think 2006 will have even greater impact. And then I also am confident or optimistic that the Women's World Cup will follow suit and return back to these shores fairly soon, if not in 27, hopefully, the cycle after that. But so I think the combination is going to be just massive for both the men's and the women's sport. And increasingly, my attitude has been for these incredible athletes that over time, if you have the opportunity to play in a Los Angeles or New York or some of these other cities, a lot of other things being somewhat equal, meaning compensation, players are going to jump at it. So it's one of many reasons why I'm so bullish on the sport in North America, not just at the MLS level, but obviously where I spend my time, which is with the USL.
Thank you, Brett. Okay, so one more question. What will the difference, Chip, between the MLS, USL, NISA teams that survived and those that thrived following the pandemic?
Well, I think those that continue to invest in their long-term strategy and don't use the pandemic as an opportunity to pare back their efforts. Easier said than done, of course. Some teams may be over-leveraged. Some people may struggle with understanding how best to get from point A to point Z when everything seems so cloudy in front of them. But I do believe those that continue to invest in their people, first and foremost, those that have been on the ground really creating an understanding of what the property means in that particular community, the ones that build those relationships is of exponential importance. I think this is a chance to be even more innovative than they've ever been, really seeing the world through a different lens and understanding how the brands are thinking. Brands are going to have a different strategy moving forward in terms of how they invest in these leagues. Teams have to be able to adapt to that and understand it. Also be willing to tell a story that's a little different than the one they told before. But again, I think those that continue to invest in experts in the space, those that have the proper skill sets, don't hesitate to look for outside influence. I think there are a lot of people out there, as you see on this panel, that have a great deal of intellect around the game, much less the industry. I think everybody needs to rally around one another right now and prop each other up for long-term success. And I think the teams and the leagues that are willing to ask for assistance and those that continue to be bullish on their future and really activate their partnerships and their season ticket holder base with confidence will be those that are best served to be successful long term.
Cool. There is a question from the public.
Brando, I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to step in here. We really don't have time. I'm so sorry. The clock went out some time ago. I'm sorry to be so rude, but we do have other sessions to go to after this. Sorry about that. But just briefly, thank you very much indeed to Chip, to Jordan, to Brett, to Patrick, and to Brando for guiding us through that conversation. Resumption of play, critical learnings from the implementation of the new normal in sport is coming up next in less than 5 minutes' time. We'll see you in a moment.